Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Louise Phipps Senft. She's a keynote speaker, attorney, mediator, executive coach, and author. Louise, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. I feel welcomed.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I think you have kind of a ton of experience. You're doing a bunch of kind of interesting things, but maybe before we kind of get into some of that stuff, let's start out with getting to know you a little bit better and start off with kind of where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in a couple different places. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and then my parents moved to New York City, and I was there until my father was actually tragically killed in a commercial airplane crash, and my mom moved us back to the Midwest, where she was from, Springfield, Illinois. So I sort of claim all three places. I think they've really shaped who I am.
Sure.
But I am probably spent most of my growing up time in the Midwest.
No, that's great. So you've kind of been to obviously university and whatnot. What got you kind of passionate about like law and kind of getting into the whole space?
Well, I became passionate about law, I would say, because my mother and my grandmother would always say, "Oh, this is Louise. She's going to be the first female president of the United States," when I was like 5 years old.
That's awesome, though.
So, and you hear that hundreds and hundreds of times.
There's still time.
And then, right. Well, I think what it instilled in me was I needed to learn a lot about systems, and I always just saw that I would be doing things in the world. I never actually had any desire to then truly be president of the United States, but it was more engendering of what it was that I felt I needed to do, because there were these expectations, wonderful expectations that my family had of me. And so it then led in some ways naturally to law school, when my mom would also tell me about different places in Washington, D.C., like Search for Common Ground being one, and the kind of work that they were doing around advocacy. And that was exciting to me.
No, I think that's great. So you got out of university, you've kind of been doing a bunch of kind of stuff, from obviously like teaching and kind of working at companies and being a board member and kind of mentoring and the list kind of goes on and on. But walk me through that, your kind of career, kind of before you end up kind of doing your own thing.
Well, after the University of Virginia, UVA, and law school at Washington and Lee, I then went to Washington, D.C. and worked in a really large firm and focused on First Amendment issues.
Interesting.
And then I worked in Baltimore, Maryland, moved to Baltimore, and worked in a large firm in general litigation, and found that there were a number of corporate executives and people who are managing large groups of people in medical institutions, as well as insurance companies and financial companies, where they had family problems and family issues.
Okay.
And those issues really attracted me. So I became one of the two attorneys in my large firm that was willing, but actually I liked it very much, handling things of divorce or DUIs, small collection matters that had people their finances basically in a knot. And that really led to my then finding that this passion that I had for the law. As a litigator, I was trying a lot of cases back then. It was in the 80s, that it really was not only an inefficient process, but actually I began to turn away from anything that was adversarial, believing that it was even wrong to carry people's personal lives into the courtroom, because the courts were just not equipped whatsoever to give the time that people had an expectation they would have in telling their story, and that judges were rendering decisions on small little bits of information based around what was legally relevant, when that was really just a part of what was important for clients and individuals. And so it began to really shape a very different worldview than the one that I had around helping, around issues of social justice and helping people. And I found that people really were quite capable of managing and handling and making some decisions when I could empower them with legal information and actually begin to bring them together, what we would call settlement conferences back then, which attorneys rarely had unless they were ordered to have them.
Okay, interesting.
And so I began to initiate them regularly in my practice, because I had, I might, even as a young lawyer, have been handling, say, 40 cases at a time. And so I began to try and make phone calls and kind of go back and forth and see what might be possible. And it was really related around settlement. And that then really grew to just simply bringing people together. So I believed that dialogue was the way to go. I had some formative training when I was in law school, luckily enough, because one of my professors in the school that I chose had one of the, I think, 3 courses in the country at the time on negotiation and mediation. Yeah, so I got really lucky. And I then left the large firm and struck out on my own to start Baltimore Mediation, with a belief that people being brought together in face-to-face dialogue could work out their own issues, and they didn't have to be in dispute, but rather they were simply in conflict or confused or uncertain, and that dialogue and mediation, and the kind of mediation that I wanted to offer, would be one process that could actually be one of the better processes for them, and also save incredible amounts of time and money.
No, I think that's really great. And one of the main reasons I kind of wanted to have you on the show was obviously you kind of do mediation and stuff for kind of couples and families. But the big thing that I really wanted to kind of cover with you was kind of how you work with kind of groups and businesses and kind of different organizations, because obviously kind of in the startup or business game, I know like the thing startup to me is always kind of weird because it's kind of like a trendy word, but it's like, the legal side of this stuff, or kind of when companies need help, whether they're struggling with something, and having somebody like yourself kind of come in and work through that, so they can maybe save the company or kind of part on, at least somewhat decent terms. So I'm kind of curious to know, and I'm sure the listener is too, about kind of how you work with kind of different businesses and organizations to actually kind of help with their kind of disputes and kind of how they come to resolutions, and kind of what your process is around that.
Well, it can look very different with regard to how I work with different groups or organizations or startups.
Okay.
But one of the threads that is completely holds it all together is I would only enter a project with a belief that people had capacity and with the ability to talk to any and everyone and in different configurations. Okay. So that if they were like, this is only going to be, just these 2 people, I'll begin in any way that the company would like for me to, but I will always say to them that in order to do this work, it needs to, if there are others who become important to this conversation, that they be allowed in, that if there are other decision makers that are basically barriers, that they be allowed in or actually mandated in. And so it's always around how it is that I can help bring people together. And sometimes that is more than 50% of the work, because it can be like herding, cats,
Sure.
for people who, don't like each other at all, or people who are just too busy. It's not about whether they like each other or not. They're just hugely busy, executives or other professionals.
Sure.
Or it can be people who really have a number of different reasons for not coming, because there's a fear that things could get worse if they came,
Sure.
or that they could lose something, including face saving. So I believe very, very deeply in face saving for people, and also in transparency, because when you know what you're working with and you have the information as much as you possibly can derive up front, and a lot of that can be through a mediator who acts as neutral. It's around information imparting, and then making sure people have the opportunity to ask questions and then create decisions. So the goal, regardless of which group it is always to help people change that quality of their interaction that was negative and destructive or keeping them apart to something that is much more positive and constructive as they explore data, sift through information, and make the most informed decisions that they can, which can be around process, which can be around how they work together or how they don't, can be around their departments, merging, interfacing, can be around people actually being laid off or put into different departments, can be around how people are growing and how they're going to expand their product or their field, can be around how people are actually moving into just different unknown territories and how they'll use their resources and timelines. So whatever the group is facing, I follow them on their agenda and make sure to provide to them, helping them to create the safest space that they can to ask a lot of questions and have time to get the information that they need from not just the 2 or 10 or 50 people who are involved in the process, but others outside that process who can also inform them. And then a lot of the work is also related to whom it is that they need to be interfacing with to carry the message and the decisions that have been made, so that the system is being held and supported, rather than people continuing to make decisions in silos. And so that's really where some of our most important work comes in. So it's convening people through those barriers, and then once they are convened, holding them together, really through helping them decide what information they need to impart to whom, when, on timeline, roles. And so it looks very different than just a classic, somebody has a dispute over a lot of money, bring in a mediator. Our work is much more nuanced and related to humans and individuals. And startups, they're especially fun because there's so much energy and excitement. And, companies that have been around for a long time, whether they're small or whether they're large, go through times when they're shedding, and it can sort of feel a little startup-like. How do they pull from already a very tight budget, or how it is that they begin to expand in a way that doesn't, cost them immensely, where they have to fold their tents. And so startup is more of an energy and a viewpoint, but in a very classic startup mode, where people are coming together and probably out searching for new monies, and there are venture capitalists who are coming in to prop it up or wanting to have a role. Two pieces that we find that are just so overlooked are ways that we hope that we can help people to surmount. And the first is asking the kinds of questions that people oftentimes don't dare to ask, because they're afraid that the mission could sort of fall apart because the relationships are not well established. The unknown and uncertainty is so high that when you can have a neutral facilitating the kinds of questions, like what happens if, or if this doesn't work, then what? Or, how good are you for, this money, or for how long? Or are there circumstances or conditions under which you would no longer be lending money? Or, have you ever done a takeover before? Or have you ever been part of the kinds of things that you just can't get through even a very good due diligence.
Sure.
So that's a pretty exciting process that we can offer people on the front end.
Sure. And this is kind of something that I've kind of been curious about since we kind of last chatted. How do you find or deal with the kind of different generations? Because I'm a millennial and I work kind of targeted as the lazy generation, which is fine, whatever. I don't really care. And to be honest, it actually works.
You don't really care that as a millennial that you're labeled as lazy?
I'll tell you why. Because then there's no bar for me. So if it gives me less competition, right? And I think it's more of a driving factor to say, like, don't network online. It's great because I do that all the time. It's like the people that are actually kind of motivated to do better, if they're people in their age range aren't willing to do that, I'm at an advantage. So I always joke, like, don't network on LinkedIn or other kind of networking event things because it's great for me, right? And by me saying that, I hope it motivates people to prove me wrong, right? And I'm that type of person where I need that kind of motivation, right? And I think there's lazy people and there's motivated people in every generation, and there always will be, right? And they get it. So to me, it's funny, right? But back to my kind of original question is, do you find a lot of the struggles that you guys deal with in kind of the business space, whether it's a startup or a big kind of large organization, do you find that just maybe it's a generational gap thing that they just can't really relate to each other? Because as I'm 34 now and I'm starting to get older, obviously, and, you know, I start thinking kind of in some respects like how my dad used to say, like, I don't understand the music of today, or like some sort of big trends. Like, I just don't get it, right? Like the finger spinner thing. I was like, I don't get it. But I remember being younger and there was things that we needed to have that our parents didn't get, right? So do you find just in a lot of it is just like a generational thing, or is that kind of too broad of a thing?
Oh, I don't think it's too broad at all. It's very broad. Probably never too broad, but I think generational differences are very real and probably always will be, just even with the examples that you just gave. You know,
Sure.
You remember your parents would say the same thing, or possibly their grandparents,
Sure.
and now you. We just happen to have a lot of focus on, millennials, and prior to that, there was a huge focus on baby boomers, and
Sure.
both of those, cultural labeling can still be present, some of which might be accurate, a lot of which might not be. And so what we find is whatever people present with, like if they say, look, we're millennials, or look, we're older and we don't get you. We just follow that, So, okay, so if you're millennials, what's important for you, around that? Are there aspects of the label that are limiting? Are there aspects of the label that are empowering? So that's a kind of dialogue that we would help people to have, and something in our work that's, because it's not focused on getting people ever to agree. It's much more authentic. Yeah, no, agreement is just a byproduct of our work, and it's highly likely, but not because we have any stake in wanting to get people to do anything around agreement. So when you don't resist, which I think in some ways, Kevin, for you, was a bit of the story you were even sharing about, hey, I'm a millennial, I'm lazy, and it's actually been a good thing because, with the motivation factor, it might just be indicative for you or for your personality or somebody like you.
Sure.
But from the perspective of a relational professional, a relational mediator, when there is someone in a conversation who is staying grounded, and that's something that we write about a lot, this idea of, maybe and maybe not.
Okay.
And staying very open and curious to be able to ask more, it really provides a much more expanded version of a person or of a group of people, especially when the label could have been so broad that it actually is limiting.
Okay, interesting.
And that's very empowering. And
Sure.
and so for us to not resist or try to get people to agree or to see it the other person's way, simply have it modeled by the mediator, by a relational mediator who says, yes, of course, and that's how it is for you. And it's important. And what about that do you think matters right now, or how do you wish for people to see you, or how do you wish for people to understand further if they so choose? So without resisting, people then are much more willing to be able to see the other person's point of view, and they don't have to expend a lot of energies trying to then defend or fight for their place at the table, because there has been somebody there who's made it okay for them to hold whatever viewpoint they wish to hold, or to see themselves in whatever way they so choose, and offers the opportunity for the other. And that's very, very powerful. And in particular, when we do hear a lot of labels that can really be quite limiting, but staying grounded and really sort of facing the reality of the generational conflicts is really important. Something that comes to my mind too, that I don't see there being much focus on, but where there is such opportunity, is around the generation called millennial and the generation called baby boomers. If it is true, and I do say if,
Sure.
but of a number of people, let's say older Caucasian men being laid off to make room for 30-year-old somethings in the sales world and the tech world and so forth. So, and instead of fighting about, it's discriminatory, it's wrong, or what do you expect, and we have to keep up, it's the only way to help the bottom line. All those things can be true, but without fighting about them, what if the conversation was just face reality? Okay, so there are all these people who are being pushed out of the workplace, or asked to leave the workplace, or snuffed out, or spun out, or stamped on, and there are all these other people who are coming in to take their place. What would it look like for those people who were being forced out? Where will they go? What might the next generation have to offer in terms of ideas around that? Those would be really cool conversations to have.
Sure. That's
as opposed to, that it's just wrong and here comes another generation, because it's certainly not the first time where the older generation gets replaced. It's just happening at an earlier age, because through technology,
sure,
where the changes are so rapid.
Do you also think though too, and I don't really, like, obviously there's good and bad that happens on the internet, but I don't mean this in a negative point. Like, I think it gets publicized more now just because we have access to information globally, right? So you hear about it more, and maybe it's always been happening, it's been happening forever, but you keep hearing about it just because of, we have access to information and kind of the global, space and kind of business arena, and you're always like, okay, well, this company's doing this and this company's doing this, and you keep hearing about the same things, good and bad, kind of globally. So maybe it seems like a bigger problem now than it was maybe like a few decades ago, or do you think it's really, to your point, like just it's becoming a lot worse because of technology?
Well, I don't know that it's becoming worse,
okay,
if you will, because of technology, but I do believe that technology is heightening and quickening
no, that's fair.
Communication in ways that, in some ways, where the human psyche and brain actually can't keep up with it as quickly. The aspect of, do I think it's always been that way, or is it because of communication is so great, we're just hearing about it more? I mean, perhaps, but in my field around communication and conflict, One view that I hold is that communication actually shapes the experience. An experience shapes the communication. So some things that may have been happening around the world all along that are exposed, if you will, or even reported on in a positive kind of way, we don't see those as much as we see things that are exposed. Because they are exposed, they seem to shape other mindset and behavior that might actually be creating then instances and behavior that would not have otherwise have been created but for the quick communication. And I think that is a really interesting piece also around the brain and neuroscience as well.
Sure. And I think too, like just understanding where the other person's coming from, especially, and again, I've kind of seen this happen where you have somebody that's maybe like say in their 20s or in their 30s trying to pitch or get investment from somebody that's maybe in their 50s or 60s, right? And just trying to understand that kind of type of person, because, and if you can kind of tailor your pitch or whatnot to kind of that personality type, is probably going to get you along like a lot better and maybe getting investment. Where if you come in a little bit more with kind of a different approach, or maybe even like, I know, and I shouldn't say necessarily like appearance and certain things kind of play into different generations. I know like obviously more and more companies are kind of embracing kind of like do whatever you kind of want, but it used to be, and certain companies are still a lot stricter with kind of dress code and stuff like that. But if you kind of come into a pitch meeting, at least in my experience, with, you know, kind of like ripped up jeans and maybe like a t-shirt, or if you came in with like a suit or kind of like a business casual thing, you're going to be, obviously the first impression is going to be a lot different, right? So I guess the point I'm trying to get at is going in and kind of understanding the person that you're at least trying to, you know, either get money from or resolve the conflict for. If you at least understand their side or their maybe triggers that could kind of set them off a little bit, kind of whether it's appearance or kind of personality or kind of things like that. Do you find some of that stuff plays into part of that or no? Because like even in my own experience, like my grandpa, for example, was very much on, like used to even give us kind of a hard time if we had like ripped jeans, for example, right? And so, you know, like if you didn't want to get a hard time from grandpa at dinner, just put on jeans that didn't have a hole in them, even if it was like trendy at the time. Do you know what I'm trying to get at there?
Sure. I think so. It sounds as though you're asking my thoughts on whether the way someone presents themselves from an appearance perspective, if that matters or has an impact on startup meeting or a conflict.
Yeah.
And is that really kind of the question?
Well, a kind of appearance and an almost like attitude towards the other person. Because like going back to my grandpa example, like I could care less if he really thinks that I'm wearing like holy jeans or not. But like sometimes it's just not worth the like having that kind of conversation, when if I can do something small on my end to maybe like help the situation along or not even bring something into a conversation. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to get at there?
Well, we certainly have known for many, many years in their organizations that focus on this specifically, that if you are going into a difficult meeting where there's a different cultural set, whether it's with others who are American or non-American or European or Asian, or you're over in the other parts of the world, and we certainly know generationally from kids and what's expected in certain restaurants, even here,
sure.
At home, or other the opera versus fast food, and
sure.
How things have changed. I mean, there are those kinds of expectations abound throughout the world, and there certainly are groups that have focused on how it is that one could prepare a little bit more fully to understand a culture that you were going into. Certainly the role of women and dress,
Sure.
or shoes, or the level, voice decibel, or whether you bring gifts or not, and how you shake hands or not and bow. And I mean, so much has been studied and disseminated for those who are interested, and I have certainly benefited from their work on preparing when meeting with difficult circumstances and or people whom you definitely wish to show respect to, in order for a mediator, of course, to do her work. But I do think, all that said, that regardless, believe it or not, of how one presents, well, let me say, for you probably might know what I think, but let me just give a nod to our amazing brains. You know, we're blessed with brains that are just so quick. That's where judgment comes in, because the brain just scans for what's familiar, which allows us to maneuver very quickly in the world and go through all kinds of information, and, you know, walk and drive and speak and multitask, because our brain is used to, has grooved, you know, what it is that we've done before. And so when one comes to a meeting that is either fraught with conflict or is going to be difficult, and a peer shows up in a dress, you have referred to your grandfather and your holy genes a number of times, in a way that the brain flashes a quick judgment, that ability, and certainly this has been studied and written about by others as well, again, from whom I have benefited, but that quick judgment has, on the positive side, that same quick judgment that allows you to do so many things.
Interesting.
So I think it's really just to be understood and appreciated, if you will. That said, regardless of how someone shows up, attitude will always, the human heart beats strongly and yearns for understanding. And when regardless of how one is dressed, and regardless of gender, and regardless of age, and regardless of color of skin, when one acts in a way that is truly engaged, and we write a lot about a quality of engagement and a quality of being centered, regardless of how one is dressed, and regardless of that quick impression, therein will a much deeper conversation begin, because of the skill set of relational engagement. And so that's actually quite exciting about our work.
Interesting.
That we can speak a lot about those other things, which I do find valuable, but what pierces all of that is a quality of human interaction. And that's really what is we're really, really interested in improving the quality of human interaction. And, of course, if the way one dresses is, step one, where it can show respect at the get-go, then do it.
Sure.
But there's something that's more profound than just how one is appearing in garb and choice of dress.
Sure. And I guess understanding just where the other person's coming from and why they choose that is interesting in itself, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that ability to listen fully for why someone chose that without being negatively judgmental.
Sure.
Even if you disagree very strongly,
sure,
it's very powerful to be able to listen to someone else fully, because they will much more likely be able to listen to you.
Sure. No, that's fair. The other thing then, I'm curious then, is how do you guys work with people that are maybe don't want change, even though they maybe deep down know that they need it? Because, to either grow the business or kind of go in a new direction, or how do you guys kind of handle that? Because that's got to be really tricky if you have like a few people that, or one person on the team that's maybe like very senior, or the CEO or something that's like, no, this is how we've always done it. we're not changing, but like they need to for whatever reason because their business might die.
So that issue is one that comes up when we're working with really any kind of a group. They'll come to us because they're asking us to come in to help them with some kind of change, whether it's integration or whether it's, moving departments or how it is that the executive team, will make some different decisions because the CEO wants them to understand X, Y, and Z. One of the first pieces that we will do with any engagement is to say our job actually is not to get people to change.
Okay.
It's similar to not getting them to agree.
Okay, interesting.
Our job will help you if you're the ones who are interested in being change agents. Our job will be to help you be the most effective change agents you can be in your organization while inviting the others along. And we'll coach and give process and good forum for that and lots of dialogue. But we will not come in with our, here in comes Baltimore Mediation to change the culture, or here in comes Baltimore Mediation to change the executive team, or in comes Baltimore Mediation to change the family business. It's rather in comes Baltimore Mediation to facilitate the dialogue around change, and whether it will happen or not. And if so, what it will look like and under what circumstances and timeline and resources and give and take and all those kinds of pieces.
Sure. And then I guess if people kind of move on because they don't agree, it is what it is, like that's got to happen, right?
Well, people actually, it's not that they move on. It's like we tried.
Okay.
It's more that they have to, our most effective work when it comes to large groups of people, really large organizations, is in laying the foundation with the leadership.
I see.
How willing are they to stick with the process when things are not going to move potentially as quickly as they wanted, or they're going to get messier, or they're going to be called upon. There are going to be points of view that will be given voice and credence for them to consider. They don't have to agree and they don't have to do anything about it, but how willing are they to engage in a process like that? Because truly, it's the only kind of process that will then have as an outcome agreement or change. You see, it's kind of a cultural approach.
That's interesting. Yeah,
and some people have said to us, like, "Oh, that's so counterintuitive," and I say, "Oh, it's not counterintuitive at all. It's counter to the ego. It's counter-egoic. It's highly intuitive."
Yeah, no,
highly
that's fair.
intuitive.
But then how do you guys kind of work at removing the ego from these conversations, right? Because it has to be, to some people, like ego can be everything or nothing or everywhere or somewhere in between, right? Just based on personality types.
Well, removing ego, again, would not be one of our goals.
Okay.
Because, ego is necessary, right? Power is necessary.
Okay,
everybody
sure.
has an ego. Everybody has power. They might not, be aware, or they might not be using it in a way that other people like. So again, it's allowing people to come together to speak about if there's too much ego, and that's a topic we facilitate. If it's too little and they need to have more investments, that's a topic we would facilitate. If it's too posturing and too blustery, that's a topic that gets facilitated. And one might say that's not on the agenda, the ego or his or her huge ego. But indeed, it's exactly what is a barrier that others speak about or acknowledge or reference. And so a really good relational mediator hears those pieces and lifts them up to ask if there are any other requests to be made of the other person or any other understanding, as they're still talking about what might be something very concrete around, the finances or a decision that would be made for an organization. You see? So for a mediator, for us, it's all those aspects are equally on the agenda, if you will.
Got you. Yeah, that's That's actually quite interesting because so many people talk about removing things that you can't remove from human beings, right? Because like you just can't. Like it's just there, right? But to your point, like being able to kind of control or add some basically, right? Like is interesting.
Well, we find, and when we wrote Being Relational, that what people have is themselves, right?
Sure.
And human nature and human beings. And when you have the beauty of and the incredible benefit of working with a third party who's truly neutral,
Sure.
but very, very proactive about improving the quality of interaction, it's not what the mediator thinks is quality interaction. It's what the participants think.
Sure.
So when they say, you're just, you're a bonehead, and you're a jerk, or your department are huge bullies, we just follow that through, and the quality of engagement, allowing them not to stay in that conversation, and being centered to not judge them, but to be very aware of our own bodily responses, to stay curious. Like, so what does that mean? And what is it that you all need to say about that? That quality is something that is very difficult to do unassisted.
Sure.
But we wrote about it to show people how they can with practice. And of course, we have many trainings that teach professionals and all kinds of people a relational skill set. And it's when you approach something purposefully, relationally, to not only maximize your own self-interest, which would be a transactional approach, but rather to never lose yourself, but to be open enough to the other's point of view, whether you agree with it or whether you don't. It will simply expand what the options and the possibilities are for both. And it's in that interaction that the experience, the human experience itself, can change. And so someone who had a quote unquote lot of ego, whatever that means,
Sure.
assuming that it was, raised by the other person as a barrier, they have a chance to soften that, to have a moment of self-awareness, maybe to get under it and explain what all that, quote unquote ego was about, or why it's there, or what it needed to protect. What was something that was much more fragile underneath. And that is the beauty we find and we write about, and people, thousands of people report. That's the beauty of taking a relational approach. And people do emerge better for it.
Interesting.
Whether they decide that, they have accomplished all of their goals, or they have truly changed, the culture that they wanted to, or they have, made it through everything and all the decisions that they hoped they would make, or not. They have a different experience with each other. And, per your question earlier, regardless of how they showed up dressed, people shift and can literally change themselves, not because the mediator forces them to change or expects them to, but rather provides the hospitality and the space where change can take place, if so chosen.
No, that's great. I love that. And I think that's the perfect kind of way to kind of close out the show. We're running out of time. So let's maybe mention where people can get more information about yourself. And you do kind of a bunch of events and kind of trainings throughout kind of North America. And obviously, like, people can probably have you guys come in. So do you maybe want to mention where people can get more information and find out about your kind of upcoming events and training?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You can find us at, these are 3 websites, baltimoremediation.com.
Okay.
You can also get more information at that site on trainings. You can find out about a relational approach at www.beingrelational.com. You can also get involved. We have a nonprofit called Orens, and that website is joinorens.org. And you can also learn about and find out about different places where I will be keynoting by going to the website. You can call the office. We're in a number of places around the country and around the world. Make a trip to The Hague this fall with a group that a number of mediators and I were part of the founding of, as we do some Peace Summit work in Amsterdam.
Perfect. That's great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
I appreciate it and hope that your readers will read Being Relational. It can really be a little bit of a life-changing book. It's small and calls upon a lot of the wisdom of others, and I so appreciate this time, Kevin. It's been very lovely.
Perfect. Thanks very much, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.